Hey guys, today we're doing an ink and wash tutorial. The materials we're going to be using today are Dr. P.H. Martin's Black Star Waterproof India ink in matte, but you can use any waterproof ink that you're comfortable with using. We're going to be using dip pens. Specifically, I'm going to be using a caged G nib in a Tachikawa or Kuretake nib holder. We're going to be using Strathmore 300 series watercolor paper. So this is a cellulose paper with quite an assertive texture that can be very fun to ink on. I have printouts over on my Patreon if you would like to work using my sketches, or you can use your own. And we're also going to be using our favorite watercolors and our favorite watercolor brushes. We're going to begin by inking. If you're looking for dip pen inking tutorials, I've got plenty of them here on the channel. I have already printed out my pumpkin and leaf sketches on these papers. Like I said a minute ago, you can find the printables on Patreon. And I'm going to go ahead and prepare my dip pen. I am working with a G-nib that has had a spring welded onto it. That gives it a longer draw. I'm also using dinky dips containing a little bit of my Black Star ink, but you can use the glass bottles that they sell at Dollar Tree if you're looking for a similar solution. The nice thing about dinky dips though is that they make silicone and they make wood holders, and that prevents them from spilling. And I also have a scratch sheet of inking paper beside me, as well as a little ramekin of water. So I am going to begin by very carefully inking my leaf illustration. As I mentioned before, I have a lot of tutorials that really dive into the nitty-gritty of inking with nibs. So rather than rehash all of that, I will link it for you guys and we can just kind of consider this inspiration. If you don't want to use a dip pen to ink this, you do not have to. I think brush pens would provide that really beautiful flexible line art that I like so much, and I would recommend using a Sakura Pigma FB if you're looking for a waterproof brush pen that is affordable and accessible. I use those all the time and I highly recommend them, and I think they would work very well for this project. So the Strathmore 300 series cellulose-based watercolor paper that I'm inking on here is a thinner watercolor paper, so it's not really suitable for like heavier watercolor, heavier layers of water applications like what I normally do with my watercolor illustration, but I think it's really nice for an ink and wash like this. It does have a very assertive texture to it, which is a quality that I was looking for this, but if you're looking for an inexpensive watercolor paper that's a little bit more mild-mannered, I also highly recommend Canson XL for this sort of a project. It has a much more gentle texture, but I wanted a paper that was going to have lots of fun little nooks and crannies without constantly catching on the sharp tip of my dip pen, because G-nibs do have kind of a sharp tip and you want to be kind of selective about what kind of paper you choose to use when you're inking these kind of things. So I went with the Strathmore because it was kind of a best of both worlds scenario, and because I was preparing for a class and I had a couple of projects that were going to be utilizing the Strathmore anyway. So when inking, just kind of remember to take your time, relax, breathe as you create your brush strokes, create your nib strokes. I like to kind of breathe in as I pull a stroke, breathe out as I pull a stroke, and that kind of helps control the breathing. The beautiful thing about dip pens like this, especially G-nibs, is that they are very flexy, so they are very capable of very fine lines as well as much thicker lines. So they are a lot of fun to ink with. But another thing to keep in mind about these is that they deposit ink, and that means they put down a lot of ink. So it takes a while for them to dry. So remember to take breaks, to turn your paper frequently, and consider using a blotting sheet so that you don't smear your ink everywhere. Again, if you're looking for kind of an easier version of this project, you can achieve a similar effect using a brush pen. One of my favorite things to do while I'm inking like this is just to relax and listen to some music that I enjoy. I have ADHD, so, rock doesn't really bother me. It doesn't really get my heart rate up. It's something that's easy for me to work with. So the kind of music that I like to work to might be very different from the kind of music that you like to work to, but basically just find something that works for you, works with the pace of your brain, and that you can kind of it works with the inking that you're trying to do rather than making your heart race or making you anxious or being overly distracting. And sometimes it takes a while to find the kind of music or the kind of media that you can have on in the background for company. I also love to do these kind of time-lapse pieces while I'm watching somebody else play a video game, particularly visual novels. I'm a big fan of Espoir's playthroughs, and I love watching her stuff while I'm working on art. It just makes for wonderful company. So having a YouTuber on that you enjoy, who does the kind of stuff that you like to do but you may not have time to do, can also make for great company while you're working on your art. So I want to point out that this has been time-lapsed by about 8x. It took me about 30 minutes to ink this piece, but that's just kind of a guideline. It takes however long it takes. If you're faster, that's fine. If you're slower, that's fine. And I allowed it to dry, I would say, for at least an hour, but I think I left it like over a couple of days. And this is what my inked illustration of the maple leaves turned out like. Of course, yours is going to be different, and I think that's wonderful. That's one of the beautiful things about art. So next, I am challenging myself a bit more with this pumpkin here. So for both of the illustrations, I did have reference images that I was using because I really wanted to focus on, especially with the pumpkin, utilizing very soft, gentle, smaller hatch marks to create the illusion of texture and the illusion of depth, and to really add something to it. Because the thing about like line and wash, there's a variety of ways that you can do line and wash. You can do something more open and more gentle, like what I did with the maple leaves, or you can do something that really leans heavily on the inking aspect of ink and wash, and then leans very lightly on the watercolor aspect. And since most of the work that I share here on the channel is more watercolor focused, more layering, more texture, more technique focused in terms of the watercolor, I wanted to play around with really leaning in with those textures with the inks like I did when I was in grad school. So this is another one where you want to take your time. You want to just kind of relax into it. Maybe have something that you enjoy watching on. Make sure you have some water handy, because of course it's important to stay hydrated. If you don't want your hands to shake, maybe have a snack before you start inking to prevent the handshakes. But you just kind of want to be able to go into the zone. That's one of the things that I really love about art, is that it is very meditative and very relaxing, especially once you've kind of hit a rhythm and a cadence. And being able to just kind of go into the zone and relax and hyper focus on art can be really restorative, especially if you've had a stressful day. So I'm gonna let you guys just kind of enjoy the majority of this inking process. I will point out, when you're using dip pens like this and you're kind of reworking an area that's still wet, there's a high chance that you can your nib will catch or tear the paper. So you do want to let your inks dry before you go back into an area. I am also not at all concerned about correcting any mistakes that I may have made. I am not looking for perfection, and one of the reasons is because we're going to watercolor on top of it, and most of the correctional fluids on the market, the white correctional fluids, those are going to be noticeable if you add color on top of it. So I've found that it's really better when I'm inking to just go with the flow and try to make the mistake work for me. When in doubt, black it out, maybe fill that area with a little bit more ink, maybe go over it with a texture or a pattern, or just hope that when you add color, it becomes less noticeable as a mistake. So in order to add kind of the bumpy, both color and texture to the pumpkin, I'm just using a series of very short, little slightly curved lines curving in the direction of the pumpkin. And you guys will notice that they're kind of in a stripe formation. So I'm just picking one stripe at a time and working my way down, turning my paper as I go. To capture the silhouette and the texture of the pumpkin, or rather to capture the texture of the pumpkin in silhouette, the outline of the pumpkin itself, I'm using kind of a series of bumps. They are intended to not be all the same size, so they're of slightly varying sizes, and that gives it a more organic texture. For the side of the pumpkin that's in shadow, I am going to do more lines, and they're also much closer together. So at this point, it's been a couple of days. My inks have had a chance to dry and cure to the paper, and now we are ready to paint on top of them. You can use watercolor markers, you can use alcohol markers, but if you're going to use alcohol markers, you really need to have used an alcohol marker safe ink. I think the only bottle ink that I have found is Sol K, but I do know that the Sakura Pigment FB brush pens are also alcohol marker safe, and the Tombow Furanosuke brush pens are also alcohol marker safe. So I probably should have said that earlier on, that you can't always, not all inks are cross medium compatible, and that's why it's kind of important to do some testing. But the ink that I'm using today is waterproof, as I mentioned earlier. So I wanted to do a punch splatter technique. So I filled 3 little cups with water, and I'm going to go ahead and activate the colors that I want in my Daily Driver watercolor palette. So my massive multi-brand watercolor palette. I'm also going to go ahead and mix up those colors in our pots, because this is a very quick technique, and I actually have a tutorial where I walk you guys through this technique more in depth and show a variety of examples of how it can be used. But I figured for fall leaves, this would be just such a perfect opportunity to pull out this technique. So for our maple leaves, I do want to leave things pretty simple. So we mix up our color, and then we just start to pour. And you want to get some distance on it, because you do want to get a splatter effect, as you guys can see. And after I've poured it, I'm just going to kind of gently punch the puddles, and that's going to force the paint to splatter, which is something that I want from this. If you just want like the larger dots and you don't necessarily want the splattering from punching, then don't punch it. And I want this to dry sooner rather than later, so I am going to use a paper towel to pick up the excess paint. This does make the paint less saturated, so if you have the time and the inclination, you can allow the paint to just dry as it is to fully evaporate off the paper. This is not necessarily a good one for a hairdryer, because it can push the paint around unless you want it to push the paint around. And speaking of, if you want it to push the paint around, you could use a straw and blow into the straw to kind of direct your paint where you want it to go. You have so many options when it comes to watercolor. my yellow has somewhat dried, but not fully dried because I do want some color mixing. I'm picking up some of the sap green that I mixed, and I'm going to do the same thing. So pour from a decent height. Dab up what you might not want or the excess because it will take forever to dry with all that water on the paper. This is not a cotton rag paper. It's not going to just absorb the water. With cellulose papers, water just tends to sit on the surface. So you do need to handle it a little bit differently. Speaking of, if you're working with less expensive watercolor papers like cellulose papers, I actually have an entire tutorial where I talk to you guys about how I change how I handle watercolor to suit those cheaper papers. So if you're trying to get the most out of your less expensive papers, I really hope you guys will watch that tutorial. But anyway, I'm picking up some of the excess green. Again, it desaturates it quite a bit. You lose a lot of that color, and losing that color and losing that saturation can sometimes make things appear more muddy because everything kind of ends up the same saturation. It can be harder to tell. You're losing contrast. So if you decide that you want, a stronger green, just go ahead and mix more green paint to a smaller ratio of water. But you do need enough water that you can pour it and that you can get it to splatter from a distance. Another thing you could do though is to pick some up with your brush and just kind of hammer your brush and do splatters like that. So while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to go ahead and mix up I wanted to do a layer with these splattered colors. So I'm mixing up the next batch so that it's ready for me when my paper has had a chance to dry, rather than me kind of fumbling around trying to get my colors mixed in advance. And you do want to make sure you change out your colors, pretty frequently, since we want to make sure we're working with kind of pure, bright, saturated color for this one. And the colors that I am using, I can't really remember the yellow. It could be a gamboge yellow or it could be a cadmium yellow. I'm leaning towards a gamboge yellow, but I'm also using a scarlet lake and I'm using a sap green. And then once our green has had a chance to dry some, we're going to go ahead and pour our red, and you see how we get like a really beautiful splatter. So those metal bars that you guys see on the edges of the paper are Chinese watercolor weights. I opted not to stretch my ink and wash illustrations just to keep it really simple, but I did need something to weigh the paper down so it doesn't like bow and kip and buckle all over the place. And these long Chinese watercolor weights are fantastic. I use these things all the time. If you watch my other tutorials or even my reviews, you guys will see these really frequently. They are not expensive, but gosh, do they get a lot of use in my studio. So you can see I'm using the corner of a paper towel. I am just very gently placing it in the puddle of water, but not so that it touches the paper, because that will leave a mark, but rather just to kind of wick up the excess water. point, I decided I liked the background well enough, so I'm just going to focus on painting the leaves, and we're going to do a very simple wet into wet technique to really capture the beautiful color change in these Japanese maple leaves. So I'm working with multiple brushes. I think I've got 3 brushes going on, and I may paint an area with some red, and then while it's still wet, paint the adjacent area with some yellow or some green. It is extremely simple and not fussy at all, but what is important is that you have your paper taped down or weighted down, because even with it weighted down, you can see those areas where the paper has kind of divoted from the water. And since we're working with some very wet paints and we're working with a wet into wet technique, it is important to make sure we provide some sort of support to our paper. And then while my areas are still wet, I'm going in with a little bit of green to get it to kind of mix green into wet into wet, with the green melding into the other colors. So you can do this whichever way you like. The colors do not have to be specific. You could work all in reds, you could work with some browns, you could work with some oranges. Whatever sparks your inspiration would probably work beautifully here. You can pull up reference if you want to. You can choose to just work off the cuff. You can do something that is more evocative and maybe just do it in blues rather than going for realistic. But the real focus of this is the wet into wet techniques and the color blending to really capture the beautiful color change that we get from fall color. I allowed my first layer to dry fully, and now I'm going in with a second layer. In some areas, I'm going to reinforce the color. In some areas, I'm going to add a new color instead, because watercolor is generally a translucent medium and it works through layering, and you can get these beautiful additional colors by layering 2 different colors on top of one another. This is also an opportunity if there was areas where I wanted more saturation that I could rework the saturation. So in the second layer, I'm not just working with pure color. There's also areas where I am washing it out with just a little bit of water so that we can still see that first layer underneath. And that's also going to help soften the transitions between the layers. When this was mostly done, I could not resist. I did want to add some splatter while it was still wet. We're going to get both like the starker splatter on the background where the paper isn't wet, and then the diffused color on the areas of the leaves where it's still wet. Finally, I'm going to paint in the stem. I'm using a dark red with some brown for this. You can use whatever colors you find inspiring for you, but when I was looking at maple branches, they are kind of a dark reddish brown color, and that is something that I wanted to maintain throughout the piece. There, now our first ink and wash illustration is complete. That was really simple, and I hope you guys feel empowered to try it out yourself. I will have the sketch that you can print out as blue lines if you wish over on my Patreon. So now we're gonna move on to the gourd. I'm gonna clean up my work area just a little bit. I have a piece of chipboard that I put on my table, and that is just in case some water does seep through, so that it's not pooling on the Teflon surface of my workstation, but it's instead kind of seeping into the cardstock. So it's there as kind of a water catch. So I've put my Chinese watercolor weights along all four edges. You can tape this down if you want to. I just didn't feel like it. And I am working with a larger ceramic palette for this one of these like flat palettes. And I'm going to go ahead and add some water to it so that it's all ready, because I really want to lean even more simple wet into wet for this one. So the whole name of the game today is color, but keep it very simple and keep it very approachable. So I'm starting with that same yellow. I'm also working with some Chinese orange. This is more like a burnt kind of orange. It's still a beautiful color and it still has a lot of impact, but it's not as striking. I'm grabbing some sap green. And you can see I'm working with multiple brushes for this one. I mean, I do in general. So I'm going to start by kind of painting the majority of our gourd with our yellow. And this is going to be a quick one, very wet into wet, and we're going to be working with a lot of water. So this is one where you probably should sit down and buckle up. Maybe I'm grabbing a little bit more saturated yellow just straight from the watercolor palette, and then using my ceramic palette to kind of blend it. I am grabbing some of our Chinese orange, both from the palette and then also from, my pre-mixed ceramic section. The pre-mixed is going to be less saturated. Straight from the palette is going to be more saturated. So this kind of helps me control saturation. And I'm also using this palette as a place to kind of mix the color on my brush, so I have a good idea of the consistency that I'm going to get. And I am trying to preserve the yellow stripes when I can. Those are the lighter areas in the reference that I'm using, but I do want my yellow, or rather my orange and my green, to really mix. This has been time-lapsed pretty significantly. I think the original took me about an hour to paint because it is loose wet into wet, but it's been sped up by 8x just to give you guys kind of an overview. And the interesting thing about cellulose paper is it doesn't dry evenly. Some people find that frustrating. That is something you can use to your advantage though, because that'll give you areas that are diffused and wet into wet, and then areas where it's dry or wet over dry, and you're gonna get kind of a stronger contrast. So if you understand this property of the paper, you can kind of hone your techniques to work with that property rather than fighting with it and always finding it frustrating. One of the other nice things kind of about cellulose paper though is for these kind of more simple techniques, you can work really quickly, especially if the humidity is low in the room that you're working in. So for the stem, it is a more brownish version of Payne's Gray. I think it's probably a good amount of burnt sienna, maybe a little bit of sap green with a little bit of actual Winsor Newton Payne's Gray mixed in to kind of give it that grayish tint. So once the colors have started to dry and I want some more saturated colors, I went ahead and I grabbed Daniel Smith's Undersea Green. This is a pre-mixed convenient color. It is beautiful. It granulates out into separate colors. But basically I went and grabbed a much darker, warmer green to kind of start adding in some more contrast, some darker colors. Now, if you were happy with your gourd as it was before you did this, that is totally fine. You can tap out at any point you want. A tutorial is just meant to provide inspiration and some guidance. It is not to dictate exactly what you do. But here are my 2 finished ink and wash pieces. I had a lot of fun creating these for you guys and sharing them with you guys. I hope you guys found this helpful, useful, informative, and inspiring. Hopefully it will inspire you to pick up a pen, whether it is a dip pen or a brush pen, to do a little bit of inking and to do a little bit of watercolor in this beautiful fall season. Hopefully these colors inspired you to do something seasonal. It is Louisiana where I am at. It is 80 degrees where I am at, and we do not get beautiful fall color, nor do we really get beautiful fall weather. But if you get to enjoy fall in all of its glory this year, oh, please go out and really enjoy it for me. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys soon with another tutorial. Bye guys.